Maxi Glamour is breathtaking and blue, literally. This performance artist takes body paint to a new level, creating a fantasy world where anything is possible. You might know them as a contestant on the hit drag show Dragula, or for their fierce activism. Today, Maxi joins us to give us a glimpse into their fantasy, but also to show us who the real Maxi Glamour is. Welcome, Maxi.
Hi, how are you all?
We are sickening. um, why is your trademark blue? Why blue?
Yeah, so I'm a water sign, and it's not the real reason, but it's just one of the reasons. I think that, I was going through a spiritual journey, and I was really like tuned into like anime and Krishna and just seeing like blue creatures and fantasy stuff was just like, oh, that's really luring. And if you look at a lot of cartoons, there's not a lot of black characters. A lot of them get portrayed as blue, like in Doug or like other 90s cartoons. And even in comic books, they just kind of paint black people blue because they think brown's an ugly color. And so there's a lot of reasons. I've been doing drag for a long time. I've had to dwell on it.
That's really interesting because I grew up watching Doug and that like never even crossed my mind, but now it makes so much sense. So you're known as the Demon Queen of Polka and Baklava. Can you explain that title?
Yeah, I'm really into like absurdism, and I think that putting things together that are different to, be as a defining factor of you can kind of help you stand out and kind of, make you intentionally break from the mold. And I think that polka and baklava are two really absurd things that don't go well together, and they both are kind of, they're international. They transcend cultural boundaries. There's polka all over the world and there's baklava all over the world, and not really one culture explicitly owns it, and it's something that's like kind of shared. And I think that when we look at like art and ideas, I think it's best in some cases to like be knowledgeable where it came from and kind of make things your own without being, appropriators.
Good answer. We have to talk about Dragula. Are the challenges as scary as they look?
Yeah, I think that, season three was a little bit harder than season four. I think season four, they went a little bit less scary, like no one jumped out of an airplane. Um, I think they're pretty scary. It's pretty intense, and there's also like a lot of adrenaline goes just going through your body, being in that situation with really competitive, sometimes vindictive and shady people, and just being in that situation. It's like it's really scary, but you have no choice, really.
Yeah, when I saw that that one contestant was afraid to jump out of the plane, I was like, I've jumped out of a plane for fun. Like that doesn't seem like a scary thing to me, but some people like those are their like real fears. What
I'm
was
glad
your
she was good.
challenge?
Um, my challenge, as in like my extermination challenge,
Yes, yes.
the one that got me was we had to insult each other. That was the
Oh,
challenge. Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't seem scary to me, but um,
No.
so yeah, I'm like, that's just like how I talk every day. Um,
Right.
so what is your biggest fear?
Probably abandonment, rejection. I think those are like substantial fears that have like psychological trauma. Like, I'm not really afraid of monsters or ghosts. Maybe white supremacists. They're kind of scary.
It's very, very. Um, you've been an outspoken activist in St. Louis. Tell us about your work and the change that you want to see happen.
Um, well, the change that I want. How utopian are we going to get? Um, I, I think when it comes to St. Louis and like other Rust Belt cities, one of my biggest desires is to kind of look at the like socioeconomic barriers that create like these huge class divides and make sure that we can kind of mitigate that. I think that there are, we're living in a post-industrialized world in places like St. Louis, Cleveland, and other cities in the Midwest we really are still picking up the pieces of when all of our like factory jobs went overseas. And so we're like looking in this situation where it's intensifying racial dichotomies, it's intensifying like wealth inequalities, and that, you know, correlates to like crime, that correlates to like housing instability. And so like really looking at that, making sure that people at the lowest like financial bracket are, you know, financially viable and able to survive in this hellhole of capitalism. I think that would probably be my biggest thing to mitigate most problems.
And that's probably a huge thing to address. That the hardest thing to overcome is like how it's ingrained in our society, like capitalism, stuff like that. We're taught a certain way for hundreds of years. Like, how do we, break that way of thinking? And you seem very informed. Is like what got you into, that mindset?
Maybe like postmodern neo-Marxist literature. I don't know. I think that's probably what did it. I would say
That's what inspired like your activism.
I think that's what's inspired like a really in-depth class analysis. I think my activism really started off as like vegetarianism. I worked with PETA when I was like 12, and like just like handing out literature, being like, hey, stop killing animals, you know, this is part of deforestation. And yeah, and then I worked for Obama's campaign. And then I don't know, I think that in St. Louis, there's just a lot of complacency. And I felt maybe it's the anti-disestablishment in me to be like, hey, let's disrupt this complacency. I think maybe really where it comes down to is I wanted to be a pastor when I was a kid, and really into like ethics and trying to make the world be a better place. So maybe Jesus is the answer.
That's what I was thinking. Um, well, we use the word activism, and I feel like people nowadays might feel like that word is a little threatening, because when you're using activism, you're trying to change minds. But in reality, all it is educating. So I feel like if we use, education and maybe invest more in our education and kind of incorporate the two, that might, see some real change that we're looking for.
Yeah, I don't know. We gotta. People are mad we have a critical race theory in college. I think that's yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any advice that you would give to young queer people today?
Yeah, like a lot of advice. On what grounds though?
Just in general, with like identity, growing up, maybe they're not in the most safe environment.
Yeah. I think I I lived a very interesting life. My parents kicked me out for being queer and dressing up in like quote unquote women's clothing. And so I lived with my drag mom, and she, we were in like motels, and like there was a lot of sex work going on to make sure that like we could have somewhere to stay. What I think my best advice for like young queer people, maybe it's kind of not internally, but maybe it's like looking externally at looking at like other queer people with like outside of your network, and just trying to understand like what they're going through and seeing how it could be exponentially worse for what you're going through, and not to delegitimize your own problems, but to understand like the collective problems that we're all going through. I think that when we are showing solidarity with other people who are suffering more, if we can help alleviate the oppression that they are subjected to. I probably should give advice to like your own self, but I think a lot of times we look too much about like individualism as opposed to like collectivism, and that's how we're kind of in this tribal like society.
That makes a lot of sense. Like if we're looking at ourselves as a community and we're working to build each other up, then that's where the real change is going to happen. And sometimes you have to do a little work within yourself to get to that point to where you're helping others.
Exactly.
So you're a performance artist. What kind of performances do you do, or what would you say? How would you describe your art?
I don't know. I think In a nutshell, I tell people that I'm a performance artist. I mix drag with burlesque, with pole dancing, with ballet dance, to my own music, to costumes that I create. And a lot of times I just try to use focus on themes that are really important to me. A lot right now, a lot of my art is focused on like time and like how we are like constantly going forward and like just valuing each moment, and also like the anxiety of like things coming down to like an end. I think that my art and the performance aspect of it is just like a melange of so many things. I don't, I think drag and other art forms are they follow strict guidelines of like, this is how your gender analysis should be represented in art. And, you know, burlesque is kind of the same way. And so kind of breaking down those molds to kind of create my own lane is what I found to be necessary.
Yeah, totally. And we've seen it a lot more in recent years with drag. Some people call it new drag, but it's really people just expressing themselves in a new way that hasn't been necessarily represented until we see people like you on television, which is really awesome. So I'm going to open up the Q&A to our campers. Does anybody have a question for Maxi? Nisha.
Hi, Nisha.
Okay, hi, hello. So my main question, speaking of Dragula, right? What do you think was like the hardest like challenge anyone had to do? Like
Dealing with ignorant white people.
It wasn't an official challenge, but it was part of the experience.
It was official. Yeah, I would say that. I think that in competition settings, I think Blackness is kind of also looked as like a secondary trait. And so I think a lot of people are like, you're not even worth like me competing next to you. And so kind of fighting those like ideologies was probably like the biggest struggle that I had to deal with.
Okay.
Was there a second part of that? I didn't mean to interrupt you, Nisha.
Okay. Oh no, I muted because game. It's fine.
Okay, another question for Maxi. Kaz, do you have anything?
When you first started out, what was the hardest part?
I guess a little backstory. I started off in bands. I was like performing. And so I didn't really take a traditional drag approach. I think the hardest part when it comes to drag of coming out was maybe fighting my way through the crowds. I think that it's really hard in drag to combat. You know, there's a lot of cliques. There's a lot. I think show business is really focused on you know, monopolizing markets. And so when new performers come into the scene, they're like, why are you here? Why are you taking bread from my mouth? And then trying to delegitimize my art as like a defense to like feeling like this idea of scarcity. And sometimes it can be true, sometimes it's not. And I think proving that I deserve to be in those spaces, proving that like my descent from traditional drag was like acceptable. I've gotten pulled off of bars and told I was ugly. I've got banned for bars because I don't wear bras or boobs or nails. And so and even after being on TV, after performing all over the world, like all over the North America, let's say that. And I think that people still are like, no, that's not drag, or that art doesn't have value. And so I would say that just fighting regressive ideas of what art can be.
And you have to, the only thing to do is just to keep, you know, sharing your art, because there are people out there that appreciate it. I know that we all do here.
Or sometimes stop too. I think that, you know, that's kind of a tool of white supremacy of like, hey, are you uncomfortable? Do you not feel validated? Like, just keep going and it'll get better. I think sometimes, I know it sounds horrible, but I think sometimes it's like, you don't want to do it, sometimes I think like, hey, stopping is okay too. Hey, like taking that break. I know that sounds like might not be like uplifting, but I think sometimes, you know, if you put too much effort in things that you don't actually like, or like things that you're not getting out of it, just constantly getting pushed to like get to that finish line can be like anxiety inducing.
Totally, totally. Finn, did you have a question? You're good. So we have one of your drag family members that's our in-house drag king, Decameron May, and they have a question for you.
Yes, I saw Maxi. So my question for you is, what advice, or how would you recommend people go about looking to form community within their space in order to maybe even get started with mutual aid organization within their local communities? I know you've got a lot of experience with that stuff, so I think that might be some good advice to share.
Yeah, so I just started a nonprofit with some friends, and we're giving mutual aid to trans folk in need. I think when it comes to creating a program like that, get an accountant or a treasurer to make sure that the taxes are right so that it doesn't come out your taxes at the end of the year. I think that's a good step. But I think really getting people that can do the work, knowing like, you know, what lanes you need on the highway to get to your end goal, because we can't just do it ourselves. I think that we face burnout by knowing all of our skills and underestimating the amount of work it takes. I think really when it comes to like mutual aid, really assessing what need is needed immediately and getting direct access to the funds for that. I think raising funds through like organizations who want to look better. I know that sounds terrible, but I think, you know, there's corporations sometimes. I'm an anti-capitalist. I hate corporations, but I think sometimes these corporations are like, we need to give tax breaks to people, or we need to give money for people for tax breaks, or we need to repair our image to make ourselves look queer friendly, to make ourselves look like trans friendly. And sometimes they'll just give you $2,000 to redistribute so that they can look good. And while I don't want them to look good, I want my community to have money. And so there's like sometimes it's a dichotomy, you know, and I think, but there's also a balance of like, how can I get the access there? Because trickle down economics doesn't actually work unless, you know, it just doesn't work, but we can try to mitigate the harm from that and take the money from the rich and give it to the poor. When it comes to setting up mutual aid, yeah, I think another big thing is kind of get out of your mind like, oh, these people are just gonna use it on drugs, or like they haven't taken any like financial literacy classes, so they don't know how to spend money. And I think that when we're looking at people who are living in like extreme forms of oppression, or people who are living in poverty for such a long time, like where is our place to say how they should spend their money when their like needs should be met first, however they need them? Like if someone's like, oh, I don't have any money, but I just bought this pack of cigarettes, or I bought this alcohol. I think mutual aid should be really judgment free. If someone wants to like, I know someone wants to go and get fucked up because their life sucks and like they haven't had any money and they just got $100. I think really mutual aid has no space in saying, hey, do this, as long as, you know, there's forms of harm reduction there so that you can mitigate any negative like consequences. I would say that. That's a lot of tangents, but.
What's the name of the nonprofit that you started?
It's called Thistle. It's Trans Housing Initiative St. Louis, and we're currently creating a survey to work with the city to create policy to enact change for housing and trans folks.
For that, that's really good. Definitely, we need more of that. Do we have any more questions for Maxi?
I have just one last question, just because I think
Ask away.
this might be beneficial. What advice do you have for local youth for figuring out how to find community and organizing support groups within their own school communities, age group communities, etc.?
Yeah, I think as I'm currently in school, I'm like looking at it from a whole new perspective. I like you know, those connections that you make with class students, like, hey, you like neo-Marxist like analysis on class? I also do. This school doesn't have like a Marxist club. Like maybe we should get together and like create, like combine our common interests and our common goals to come together. I think sometimes schools are really, really hard with the bureaucracy of like creating new groups, especially for, I think we're in a great age where like being queer isn't as hard as it was when I was in high school. It's still hard. There's still, you know, we're still living in a white supremacist, homophobic world. I think really just finding people who have the same interests, have the same drives, people whose skill sets kind of mirror yours and not exactly the same, so that you, so there's not too many cooks in the same kitchen over like one skill set, so that it's spread out, so that you can, you know, obliterate white supremacy together.
Yeah, totally. Snaps. Decameron has established our we snap at Clubhouse now, and also the hearts. That's a Decameron thing. All right. Well, that was a pretty quick Q&A. We want to thank you and send you hearts for joining us.
I don't know if I can send them back.
And you may be joining us in an IG live in a future date, is what I hear.
Yeah, on a Thursday. I'm going to Mexico and then like 6 other cities in April, but I'm sure I have a Thursday available to spend with Cameron on Instagram.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we will see you there, and thank you so much for joining us, Maxi.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Have a good one.
You too.